Welcome. I'm Pastor Susie Hutchison. Pastor Bob Miller and I are grateful to be able to worship with you all today. So here we are. We're at week 4 of Lent. Easter is rapidly approaching as we continue to prepare ourselves for the good news of Jesus through our Lenten devotions and our spiritual practices. Today, we're going to look at how fear impacts our relationship with God. I'm here today after 2 weeks of being off of work. Now, I love to travel and usually go away when I have vacation time. But this year, I had a staycation for a really good reason. It was bookended by 2 big events in my life. My staycation began on the day that my second grandchild was born. This is Mabel, and she was born on March 7th. I spent some quality time getting acquainted with the newest member of my family. And while my daughter was in the hospital, I got to spend a lot of time with her sister, my older granddaughter, Harriet. Harriet's 4th birthday party was on the last day of my time off. I got a fun staycation this year. One of the things I really noticed is how children process fear through creative play. I had the pleasure of being the supporting cast member in innumerable reenactments of the Disney cartoon Raya and the Last Dragon. Together, Harriet and I faced many enemies in our pursuit of the dragon gems. And when things got fierce, we used the power of the dragon gems to keep the enemies at bay. I did something similar when I was a kid. I spent many hours preparing for what I assumed would be an inevitable fall into quicksand. Strangely, I have not yet had to use those skills as an adult. But I do give thanks to Scooby-Doo for the preparations. While I've never actually fell into quicksand, I certainly do experience seasons of life where I feel caught in some sort of metaphoric quicksand. I have seasons where it feels like the ground beneath me has fallen away. It feels like everything that I thought was permanent and secure just disappears. It feels like it's impossible to get out of the mess. Have you ever felt like that? I know I'm not alone in this experience. I know that people have felt that way through all of recorded history. I know that it is a feeling that people of faith have approached God with since at least the time of the psalmist. It's a feeling that the psalmist expresses very well in Psalm 69, verses 1 through 3. Save me, God, because the waters have reached my neck. I have sunk into deep mud. My feet can't touch the bottom. I've entered deep water. The flood has swept me up. I'm tired of crying. My throat is hoarse. My eyes are exhausted with waiting for my God. Now I remind you that the book of Psalms was a book used for worship in the temple in Jerusalem. It is songs and it is prayers and it is liturgy that the faithful people used in community. It's a holy and sacred thing to be that vulnerable with God, especially within your faith community. In the 21st century American church, we tend much more toward the stiff upper lip interactions. Oh, I'm fine. Oh, it's nothing I can't handle. Feeling blessed. Now, I don't know if that's just because our lives are just simply all magnificent, or because we feel guilty that we're not grateful enough, or if we just don't believe that the other person really wants to hear the truth. Maybe on some level we know that our despair is not permanent, and so why burden each other with it? None of that invalidates our emotions. None of it. Life hurts sometimes. It's scary sometimes. And we do not get some sort of prize just because we don't show it. Last week, Pastor Bob reminded us that God has proven faithful many, many times in history. Now, I find it easier to see that in the rearview mirror of my life. It's a lot harder for me to see God in the moment. The ancient Israelites who followed Moses into the desert, they had the same struggle. God had already done some pretty mighty acts in their life, yet over and over again, they're afraid and they feel like God has abandoned them. This story that I'm about to read to you is from very early in their journey. They have just been released from slavery in Egypt. Pharaoh has now changed his mind about the release and begins to give chase. So hear this from Exodus 14. It's verses 10 through 25. As Pharaoh drew closer, the Israelites looked back and saw the Egyptians marching toward them. The Israelites were terrified, and they cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Weren't there enough graves in Egypt that you took us away to die in the desert? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt like this? Didn't we tell you the same thing in Egypt? Leave us alone. Let us work for the Egyptians." It would have been better for us to work for the Egyptians than to die in the desert. But Moses said to the people, "Don't be afraid. Stand your ground and watch the Lord rescue you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You just keep still." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why do you cry out to me? Tell the Israelites to get moving." Did you catch that? I find it so hilarious that Moses has just told the Israelites, "Stay still and wait." Then God tells Moses, "Get them moving." Anyway, the story continues. And the Lord says to Moses, "As for you, lift your shepherd's rod, stretch out your hand over the sea, and split it in two so that the Israelites can go into the sea on dry ground. But me, I'll make the Egyptians stubborn so that they will go in after them, and I'll gain honor at the expense of Pharaoh, all his army, his chariots, and his cavalry. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I gain honor at the expense of Pharaoh, his chariots, and his cavalry." God's messenger, who had been in front of Israel's camp, moved and went behind them. The column of cloud moved from the front and took its place behind them. It stood between Egypt's camp and Israel's camp. The cloud remained there, and when darkness fell, it lit up the night. They did not come near each other all night. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord pushed the sea back by a strong east wind all night, turning the sea into dry land. The waters were split into two. The Israelites walked into the sea on dry ground. The waters formed a wall for them on their right hand and on their left. The Egyptians chased them and went into the sea after them, all of Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and cavalry. As morning approached, the Lord looked down on the Egyptian camp from the column of lightning and cloud and threw the Egyptian camp into a panic. The Lord jammed their chariot wheels so that they wouldn't turn easily. The Egyptians said, "Let's get away from the Israelites because the Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Okay, this is one of the great scenes from Moses' journey, right? Immortalized by Charlton Heston in the movie The Ten Commandments. Everyone knows this story. The people are terrified. They face an insurmountable obstacle, a sea that blocks their path forward to freedom. They can't turn back because behind them is an angry army pursuing them. When suddenly God intervenes by parting the sea, and the Israelites walk into the sea on dry ground. There was no way forward and no way back. We know that feeling, don't we? Our world is mired in it today. On the global stage, we see a war between Russia and the Ukraine. Tens of thousands of lives have been lost. You can't undo that. Buildings have been bombed. You cannot go back. But is there a way forward? Giant egos make it difficult to imagine compromise. Is there any liberation to be found for the people of Kiev or Mariupol? And if they're freed, what type of future can they build from the rubble? What hope awaits on the other side of this sea of violence? Look, we're 2 years into a pandemic that's killed over 6 million people around the world. That's as many people as live in the city of Toronto. It's a pandemic that's killed 970,000 Americans. That's the population of Fort Worth, Texas. We cannot go back and get a redo. We cannot undo the pain that those families feel at the loss of their loved ones. We cannot take back the decisions we made that resulted in the deaths of our neighbors. There is no way to go back. And this new variant, BA.2, is finding its footing in other countries. We can't help but wonder if the way forward we had hoped for might end up being blocked by it. Is there any liberation to be found on the other side of this public health disaster? Just being aware of our world today can feel a bit like being the Israelites facing the Red Sea. The hurdles seem insurmountable. Anxiety rises as we sense threats that kind of creep up on us. There's no going back, and the way forward just looks treacherous. We know that God can redeem war and pandemic. But that doesn't prevent us from having normal human emotions. Does not negate the fear that we feel. Because it is terrifying to step into a roiling, messy sea that we must cross to get to our liberation. And fear does not relieve us from reacting and acting on behalf of God's kingdom. When Moses tells his followers to stay put and trust God, God tells them to move forward toward their promised liberation. Similarly, we hear this story from Matthew. It's chapter 14, verses 22 through 33. Right then, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead to the other side of the lake while he dismissed the crowds. When he sent them away, he went up onto a mountain by himself to pray. Evening came, and he was alone. Meanwhile, the boat, fighting a strong headwind, was being battered by the waves and was already far away from land. Very early, he came to his disciples walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified and said, "It's a ghost!" They were so frightened they screamed. Just then Jesus spoke to them. "Be encouraged, it's me. Don't be afraid." Peter replied, "Lord, if it's you, order me to come to you on the water." And Jesus said, "Come." Then Peter got out of the boat and was walking on the water toward Jesus. But when Peter saw the strong wind, he became frightened. As he began to sink, he shouted, "Lord, rescue me!" Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him, saying, "You man of weak faith, why did you begin to have doubts?" When they got into the boat, the wind settled down. Then those in the boat worshiped Jesus and said, "You must be God's son." Like the Israelites faced the Red Sea, like Peter faces an angry Sea of Galilee, we too must face the roiling seas of our lives. Some of those seas are global, like war and pandemic, and we feel like we have very little control and our hearts break for those who suffer. Some of our seas are more communal, like New Orleans and facing the aftermath of that tornado, or Glendale, Arizona, who's facing a shooting at the mall. And in those times, there are things we can do that can maybe help offer some relief. And some of our fears are very personal. Job loss, financial worries, relationship failure, physical decline, or death. God does not promise a fear-free life. God does not promise a trouble-free life. God does not promise a pain-free life. As a matter of fact, the testimony of the Bible is that God's people are barraged by all those things. From Job to John the Baptist to Lazarus and Paul, none of these people had fear-free, trouble-free, pain-free lives. None of them. God's promise is that we are never alone in our fears, our troubles, our pain. God is with us. So when we're facing what feels insurmountable, go ahead and lament like that psalmist. Give God every angry, terrified word that burns in your heart, because God is big enough to handle our anger. God is mighty enough to handle our desperation and our grief. God can handle any emotion that we have. Say whatever it is you need to say to God. It is our honesty and our vulnerability that strengthens that bond between God and us. And from our human point of view, it's when we actually verbalize our emotions that they begin to lose their control over our lives. So, even in our lament, maybe especially in our lament, God will hold us. God will love us. And God will send us forth. God told the Israelites to get moving, to step into the place that they feared. There are storms on the horizon. There are storms on the horizon of all of our lives. There's no avoiding them. So we step forward. We step forward with confidence that God will be there, leading us, correcting us, rescuing us, and ultimately liberating us. After all, Jesus told Peter, "Come," because Jesus was already there. Jesus was already in the storm. The promise of God's presence did not end at the shore of the Red Sea, nor at the shore of the Sea of Galilee. That promise lives now. It lives in all the places where terror reigns, from Odessa to Yemen. It lives wherever fear resides, in hospitals and hospices, in rehab centers and domestic violence shelters. God is with us when we are wounded, when we are persecuted, when we are terrified, and when we are willing to step out of our comfort zones. Life might feel a lot like quicksand beneath your feet. And there is plenty of fear-mongering in the air. But God is with us. So we step forward trusting we are never alone. Amen.